Patrick Higney.
And I'm Richard Brenner.
And we have a great interest in your next door neighbor and their stories and their lives. And this week we have
Andy Romanoff, who I first met about 20 years ago. He was a customer of mine at my coffee house, Highland Grounds. And I always found him to be an incredibly interesting person. And we went over to his house and had a great interview with him.
We did. Well, he had a great conversation with us. You'll see that coming up. Andy's quite the talker and he's got a few stories for us. And Andy Romanoff.
Enjoy the show.
My name is Andy Romanoff. I was born in 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. My father was born in a little town in southern Illinois, LaSalle, Illinois, where he lived in a tiny little house with, three brothers in the same bed. And when the family moved from LaSalle up to Chicago, they moved sitting on top of the furniture in my grandfather's push cart. It was not a push cart, it was a peddler's cart pulled by a donkey or something. Yeah, it was a long walk. And my mother was born in Poland, and I've written about that a little bit. My mother was born in a little town called Stawisky, and she was born there before the First World War. Her father having emigrated to the United States and then being caught on the wrong side before he could bring the family over. And so she and some grandparents stayed on a little farm in Stawisky during World War II, and then she immigrated here to Chicago right after the war. So let's begin with this. All the years of my young life, my mother, as far as I knew, married my father, love at first sight, and he was a kind of a wild guy, but she tamed him and they got married. Sometime when she was probably already 60, 65 years old, one day I began to hear rumors and over time teased out the truth of this. She'd actually been married before. She had married another guy and then had the marriage annulled.
Wow.
So my mother also had some adventures. I graduated from grammar school. That is the only school I ever graduated from. And then I went to 5 high schools. I got thrown out of all of them. Lane, Von Steuben, Senn, Washburn, and Logan. After that, they left me alone. The first impression that a motorcycle ever made on me, I don't think I could have been more than 13 years old. And I saw Chicago outlaws riding their motorcycles in downtown Chicago under the L tracks. And I'm writing about that right now. And it made an enormous impression on me. These guys, these motorcycles are so fast and they're racing through traffic and they're just so, whatever the fuck I want. And it kind of blew me away. So I within a very short time after that, certainly within a year, I had not a motorcycle, but I had my first motorbike. I had a Whizzer. And the only problem with that Whizzer, as it turned out, was it actually belonged to somebody else. So after that got straightened out, then I had a series of motorcycles that I actually knew where they came from and paid for them and all that sort of stuff. And by the time I was 17, I was a motorcycle mechanic. I was building bikes and racing, and I was an alley mechanic. By the time I was 17 or 18, I think about 18, my friend Bobby V had a garage behind the house. And I can tell you the address. I better have to get you the address. And there were 3 or 4 bikes in that garage, and I was the guy, that was wrenching all of them. And one of them, sometimes was mine. So I started hanging out on the corner of Lawrence and Kedzie. There was a bowling alley there called Alba Bowl, and by that time I was pretty much done with living at home, and so I would stay out all night and hang out with the guys, and we would sit on the fenders of the cars and yell at the girls and all that kind of stuff. And then we started having motorcycles. And so I was riding off of that corner with 4 or 5 other guys. And one picture that I know you will probably want is a picture of 2 friends of mine from that time. One is Pete Walber, who a few years after this was the treasurer of the Chicago Outlaws. And the other guy is a guy named Angelo Lombardi, who was a tough guy from the neighborhood who ended up very dead a few years later in a particularly ugly way because he was sleeping with some mafioso's wife. So all of that comes before, before the part with Bobby. Also, at the same time, one day, we were bad guys, one day a guy had stolen a camera, and I forget how much, but I paid him $10 for it, and now I had a camera. And I was interested. I started to shoot pictures, and I kind of taught myself. But then I went to work for a photographer. I worked for a guy who was a classic portrait photographer, a man named Bernard Jenis, who had a studio on Kedzie Avenue. And I watched, women with pencils working on large negatives. It was that type of photography. And he had a large studio camera and a beautiful old studio with big lights and all that sort of stuff. Then I started working for another guy, Jacques Depina, who did weddings and bar mitzvahs. And so I became a bar mitzvah photographer. And I was a guy, I'd put on a suit on Saturday morning. And, hi, everybody, come on, I'd like you to, all of you four, would you please get up from the table, come back over here, stand right behind these people. I'm going to go over there. Everybody's got a smile right now. Oh, you don't want to be in the picture, sir? Oh, I understand, sir. That. So I was doing that before I met up with Bobby. Now I'm looking at my pictures and, I didn't know shit, and I didn't know how to ask for help, and I didn't know how to learn anything from others. And it's been a problem all my life. So I could have gone to school, like anybody else in the world. But no, I'd learned a little from this guy, a little from that guy. I thought the problem with my pictures, I started saying, oh, what I want is motion. My pictures are too still. And so that I knew was a big leap. And so I called a place called Columbia College, which was then in Chicago, and it was a tiny little thing. And I said, hey, I want to learn movies. They said, what do you know? And I told them what I knew about stills. They said, look, we have two classes. One of them is beginning motion pictures. You probably know everything that you would learn there, but the advanced class you could use, but we're not offering this year. But the guy who teaches it is a guy named Herschel Lewis. And Herschel is about to do a picture. Here's a phone number. Call him up. Maybe he'll hire you as a PA. So I did. And so a few weeks later, I found myself working as a PA on a nudie called Boing. Herschel took anything you could use and put you to work. It was amazing. So he had a 4x5, Crown Graphic, and I started shooting the production stills, and I learning how to load the film camera, and I'm learning how to adjust the focus, and I was in love with that camera. I was much more in love with the camera than the women, and I studied it. Every night I was like I ordered a manual from California, and I read how to oil it, how do you this and this and this and everything. By the end of that first picture, by Chicago standards, I was sort of an assistant cameraman.
Wow.
And so Herschel liked me, and he had a partner, Dave Friedman, and the two of them were just at that point cooking up the idea of gore films. And so the next picture I worked on was called Blood Feast. And Herschel and Dave, hired me to go down to Florida and shoot it. And because it was a transition moment between the end of nudies and the beginning of gore films, they actually went down there to shoot two pictures. So within 3 weeks, we shot a nudie called Belle Baron Beautiful with a stripper named Virginia Bell. And then we rolled right into Blood Feast and started shooting this now very, very classic, horrible movie. It was received by the press as the most terrible thing that anybody had ever made. And it was received with great enthusiasm by drive-in audiences. And so a picture that from all accounts didn't cost more than $20,000 to make, that I personally know was shot with about 12,000 feet of film, did over $1 million in revenues in its initial outing.
Wow.
Yeah. So they knew they were onto something, and they started to make a string of these pictures, and I worked on all of them. And by the end of Blood Feast, I was already behind the camera on some of the shots. Within a couple of years, we had made 2,000 Maniacs, and Color Me Blood Red, and Moonshine Mountain, and a slew of these hideously bad movies, all of which I was always trying to make the cinematography a little bit better against a guy who really deliberately delighted in doing that stuff as shit. Daniel Pearl's a good friend of mine. I know Daniel must have seen these movies. You know, he's the guy who shot Texas Chainsaw. So yeah, as they have enormous and rabid fan bases. And I don't mean rabid in a bad way. I'm just saying people really give a shit. You know, they really. So the place where it all starts to change is a movie. Oh my God. Something weird. It's not something weird. I always get the title wrong. Anyway, I go down to Florida to shoot a picture for Herschel. It's a Dracula picture. And I get down there and I walk in a production office, and there is the most stunning, sexy looking woman I have ever seen in my life. And I am overcome with lust. I'm 23 years old. I am just overcome. And I immediately chat her up, and I immediately invite her out to dinner. And that night we're back in a hotel room making love, and I know this is the one. And we start shooting this movie. And I'm taking a few minutes to light her face, because it's exquisite to me, you know. And Herschel is, Andy, for Christ's sake, come on, let's go. So we argued all the way through the picture every time I stopped to light a close-up of Liz. And she was a couple of years older than I was, and she had this would ultimately be her third marriage when I married her. And so she had a great deal more sense than I did. And she said to me repeatedly, you know, when I started to talk about getting serious about getting married, she said, "You're out of your mind. You know, we should never do this. Why would we do this? What more would you get from a marriage?" Oh, no, because I was determined to possess her. I was just totally determined to hold that woman like that. Picture finished. She went back to Chicago. I had work on another picture right away. The last picture that Veronica Lake ever made, also a horror film, one about Nazis and worms on her face.
So what was she like to work with?
She was wonderful.
Oh, wow.
I liked her.
Yeah.
You know, she was, you know, I mean, she was, I think, a dried out drunk at that point.
Oh.
She'd been through some hard times, let's
yeah.
just put it that way. But whatever it was, it had not diminished her as a human being.
Right.
And I really liked her. So
Oh, cool. That's
we
good.
would sit and talk between takes and stuff, you know. But
And so were you doing the cinematography on the films at this point?
I was a B camera operator, A camera operator. I was two operators. I remember we had two dollies side by side. I don't think I was the DP on it. I think I was just an operator on it. And I was pining for Liz, and I was every day and every night. I had nothing on my mind but Liz. Finally, after 2-3 weeks, I quit the picture, jumped on a plane, flew up to Chicago, went to where I knew she lived in a little apartment, and knocked on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning. And, "What are you doing here? Come on, let's go have breakfast." And I insisted, I demanded that she marry me, you know. And so finally I wore her down, and she said yes. And so within a few weeks we got married. And then I was in Chicago, and now I had to be a more responsible human being. And so I managed to get a job. I managed to get the job as the head of the film department at the local educational TV station, WTTW. And it wasn't just the head of the film department, I was starting the film department. So we bought the first cameras, bought the first lights, and suddenly I was shooting interviews with politicians and early PBS, even before PBS, it was called PBL, Public Broadcast Laboratory, documentaries on archaeology and architecture and stuff like that. It lasted about 8 or 9 months, but our marriage was falling apart because Liz really did not want to be trading on. She was incredibly sexy. She was the kind of woman that, and she wore tight clothes. And it took her 45 minutes to get up in the morning and have a cup of coffee to put on the hair and all the makeup and everything. But when she walked down the street, guys, were rolling down their windows, hey, that kind of stuff. And I was incredibly jealous, and I'd chase them. So we decided all that it would take to fix things would be to move to England, because isn't that what you always do under those circumstances? And so I quit my job at TTW, and we moved to England. So, so what do you do when, and my wife was having trouble working, was the real problem, because the work that she could get was being, a product girl standing next to a car at a trade show, or, all that kind of stuff was directly related to her, her prettiness and her body. And what she really wanted was to be taken seriously as a human being, which was a kind of a novel idea at the time. And it was a mixed message in any case, in her case. So we decided to move to England because I loved English movies, and I thought, we'll go where these guys are who know how to make this glowing, different kind of light. And so I quit my job at TTW, and we got rid of a lot of stuff. We packed everything in our car, and we drove to New York and sailed to England on the Queen Elizabeth, the last year that the Queen Elizabeth sailed, and landed in England and took a train up to London and got off and knew nothing and nobody and had no clue. And I was 23 and she was 25, and we had some trunks full of stuff, and that was, we were going to be people living in London. And we did. We went to Traveler's Aid, and they told us where we could find cheap lodging, and eventually we found an apartment, and Liz lucked out. Liz met the head of the makeup local, and she was brilliant at makeup, and he took a liking to her, so the next thing you knew, she was doing makeup on a TV show. And I discovered that although I had landed as what they call an alien spouse, which meant that I was legally permitted to work in England, I wasn't in the union. And the union didn't give a shit that I was an alien spouse. They just weren't going to let me in. So I had many months then of no work. And our marriage completely fell apart during that time. Because Liz she was making money and she was happy, and I was losing every bit of sense of who I was. Everything I knew about myself, everything I could be, it didn't matter anymore. And so I wandered the streets of London, and I was extremely unhappy, and how happy that makes your wife, who's out there working all day. So eventually, so the day came, she came home and she said, look, there isn't another guy, although there was, but I got to move out. And so she moved out, and then we emptied, when I left that apartment, I moved into some miserable little tiny British flat. But then I got a break, because I was ready to go home at that point, but I got a break, and I got a job working for a little British producer of documentary films. And so I stayed for another 6 months or something like that, and worked on a doc on the Troubles, and worked on stuff for Honeywell, industrial films and things like that. But I was miserable. I was totally unhappy. And eventually I called my mom and said, I can't stand it here anymore. And she's, loaned me some money. And I got back on a plane, the very first plane I ever flew in my life, and flew from London back to Chicago, where I was still miserable and empty and lonely and unhappy, but I was back in Chicago. One day, I left the place, and it's cold, wintertime, and I walked out on Broadway, and I'm walking down the street, and I get to the corner, and there is a bus painted in every color of the rainbow with wonderful figures on it. And there's a guy with a leather cowboy hat and a leather jacket, and just a total freak. And he's got the hood up on this old white bus, and he's swearing at it because it won't start. And I was always a fine mechanic. I didn't know who the guy was, but I kind of knew who the bus was, and I kind of knew even at that moment that this had to be the Hog Farm bus. So I said, hey man, you want a hand getting that started? And he said, yeah. So I helped him get the bus started. And he said, he told me where he was going, and I want to come along, and I said, yeah. So I got on that bus, and pretty soon I met the Hog Farm. And the Hog Farm was in Chicago to do a benefit for what was then the Chicago 8, a thing called the Turkey Trot. It was going to be on Thanksgiving Eve. And so I went with them and partied with them that night. And eventually there was an after party, and I was back at the after party, and everybody had taken acid. And it was, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I don't even remember if Wavy Gravy was Wavy Gravy yet. I think maybe he was, but maybe he was still Hugh Romney at that point. I was talking to him, and I just looked at him and I said, I'm getting on your bus, man. And he just kind of looked at me, and he said, far out, man. And I didn't even know it at that time, but that was really kind of the only way in. Was it, this was because Hugh Wavy was a prankster, right? And the prankster, ethos was, you're either on the bus or you're off the bus. And how do you know you're on the bus? Because inside something on you says, you're on the bus. So, but I didn't get on that night. I stayed in Chicago, and I started to work for guys shooting a documentary. I don't remember what the hell it was about, but eventually it ended up, I went out to San Francisco to go out to Alcatraz and shoot the Indians that had taken possession of Alcatraz at that point. And I got there, but at that time, the federal government had, there was just no way to get out there. So I spent some days trying to figure out a way to get onto the island, and I couldn't. And so at a dead stop, I remembered that Wavy was in California. And I had no idea. I truly had, at this point, how did we had no cell phones. But we had ways. Whatever those ways were in those days, I tracked him down, I called him, and it turned out he was at a farmhouse down in Santa Cruz. And they gave me an address and some directions. And so I hitchhiked down, and by the time I got down to the neighborhood, it was dark, it was nighttime. And I found myself walking down a farm road in the middle of the night, and dogs are barking, and scared shitless. And finally I came to what I thought might be the right place, and I knocked on the door, and eventually a guy comes in the door, and I said, I'm looking for a guy named Wavy Gravy, and I think maybe he's here. And the door opens, and this guy says, come on in. And so I come in because I found the right place in the middle of the night. And he says, you can sleep over there. And I do. And I wake up in the morning, and there's people, sunlight is streaming into windows, and people are sitting at a table, and I say, is Wavy around? And they said, he's gone out there. And they point out the window, and I go out, and it turns out I'm in the middle of a flower farm. And as far as the eye can see are beautiful yellow and red flowers. I walk through a path down to a bluff overlooking the ocean. I know this sounds like, like a set up a scene for a movie, because it is. And there, on a bluff overlooking the ocean, is Wavy sitting on the ground, meditating out. And I go and say, hey man, how you doing? And we start talking, and I tell him, I really want to get on your bus, man. And he says, well, okay, fine, let's do it. It turns out this is a transitional moment for the Hog Farm. So let me tell you about the Hog Farm. First there was Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. And this is the beginning of the psychedelic moment. It's Kesey and a bunch of people create this thing called the Merry Pranksters. They paint that first bus in those crazy colors. They drive it across America. Tom Wolfe writes about it in Electric Kool-Aid, the acid tests. And now, I'm not saying these guys invented the psychedelic revolution, because there's also Tim Leary, and there's a lot of action in a lot of places, but they're the most visible of the this isn't a sacred sacrament, this is a let's get fucked up and see what happens kind of approach to it all. Kesey eventually goes to jail, and the pranksters break up. A few of the pranksters end up in Sunland, Tahunga, where they get a free house to live in out in Sunland, Tahunga, way up on a hill, for taking care of the hogs on the property. And so ultimately this is where the hog farm comes from. Because they're interesting people and because they like to party, pretty soon more and more people are coming, and it's growing and it's becoming a commune. And then a guy named Stan Goldstein comes and says, we're planning on putting on this big festival on the East Coast called Woodstock. And we think you guys could do the trips, tents, and the free kitchen, and we'll pay all your expenses. Would you bring your buses across? Because by this time there are a number of hog farm buses. Will you bring your buses across and do that stuff? And so the hog farm goes to Woodstock and becomes very famous as a result of it, because they do the free kitchen to Woodstock, and Wavy is the voice of the free stage, and he's the guy who says in the movie Woodstock, what I propose is breakfast in bed for 400,000. So those guys become the hog farm, and then by a couple years later, they have a property in Llano, New Mexico, that is kind of the land of the hog farm. There's 50 buses. There are hundreds of people all calling themselves hog farmers. And Wavy grows increasingly kind of, he wants another thing, another way, because what the hog farm has proven to be really good at is diffusing tense situations and getting people to look at each other a little bit differently. But when you travel with, let's just say, 20 buses down a highway, all freak buses, it's actually a cop show. Every 20 miles you get stopped by cops, and some of them want to turn you out and look for the dope, and some of them want to take pictures with you, and some of them want to kill you. But one way or another, it takes you days and days to get anywhere. So Wavy at this point wants a bus that's a kind of a secret mission bus. And so I come in at exactly that moment, and what he invites me is to be on that bus, which I later learned was like a subject of enormous contention. People really wanted a seat on that bus. There's room for 12 people or 13 people on that bus, and that was going to be the crew of that bus. So I went back to Chicago, sold off a bunch of stuff, took my tools, and took the Greyhound out to Los Angeles, met up with the hog farm just as they purchased this new bus, which is an old Greyhound. And yes, I have pictures of that. And then we spent some weeks converting that Greyhound into a beautiful living space. It's all collaged on the inside, and star fields and music from little speakers and a kitchen, and living for I think 13 of us. But on the outside, it's a Greyhound bus. And the destination says Walla Walla, Washington. But it's a hog farm bus. And suddenly we can go 1,000 miles without ever being stopped, just rolling on through the night. And so we begin to do that. That's the moment I got on the hog farm, on the bus.
How long did you stay for?
About a year.
You're adventurous. I mean, like, responsibilities anywhere else? You just like walk away from it all, or?
I don't think I thought much about that stuff. I never treated anybody badly in my life on purpose. I probably treated a lot of people badly in the course of my life accidentally. I know I did in some cases. I was terrible to my mother, for instance, but that just wasn't what that wasn't the stuff that drove me.
Yeah, the spirit of adventure in you.
I wouldn't even have seen, as far as I knew, I said for many years, I backed through life. And I think for a long time it was kind of true. I didn't, I never saw it coming. I didn't ever say, well, I think I'll do this now. This life suddenly said, hey man, come over here. I said, oh yeah, that looks cool. Let's go. You know. So all right. So I'm living on the bus, and some adventures happen. We do a festival down in Florida, and you know, some stuff happens. But eventually, we end up in Malibu, parked in a driveway. A woman named Joyce Mitchell, who was one of the functionaries from Woodstock, and while we are there, Ken Kesey comes to town, and so one afternoon he comes pulling up to the bus, and they take a tank of nitrous oxide out of the car and bring it up into the bus, and attach a hose to it, and they start passing a hose around. I've never done nitrous, but Ken says to me, the human body is shaped like a pear. He said, what you want to do is just let that hose fill you up, he said, and fill the bottom of the pear. And so I did. And I went away to places I am still to this day trying to go back to. It was, I did psychedelics, I did a lot of stuff in my life. Nothing was ever like that first time on nitrous. I was transported to other worlds. I had an amazing time. And so then I liked it. I wanted more of it, and I started to find my way to more of it. And eventually I got off the hog farm bus, but by that time I had a pretty good idea about how to score nitrous anytime I wanted to. And so within a couple of years later, I was back. I think it was Wavy that named me Captain Gas, because it was during that time I really developed this huge appetite for it. And if there was a tank around, I was the nitrous hog. But when I got back to LA and I was living here, I connected with some guys who ran concerts, and pretty soon I could bring a tank of nitrous backstage at any of the Pacific Presentations concerts, and the dope dealers in town all knew me, and I was, hey Andy, I'm having a party on Friday night, and well, you get a tank and bring it up. And so I had entree everywhere.
But you say that you were able to score it any place, anything. Was it divulging too much to
Not
go
at all.
through that?
Not at all.
I'm curious. How does that happen?
So it began with a when I was still on a hog farm, we worked out a scam, again, because the bus was a Greyhound and we could get away with this. You could stop in a small town. You could find the local industrial supply place. You could say, I need a tank of nitrous oxide. Now, if you ask for, there's two kinds of nitrous, and it's the same nitrous. One of them is industrial nitrous and the other one is medical nitrous. The difference between industrial and medical nitrous is that when you fill a bottle for medical, you first pull a vacuum to make sure there's no residue of any kind in the tank, and then you fill it with nitrous. If it's industrial, there might be a pound of gas left in it. You don't give a shit. You hook the hose up and you fill it. Well, good enough for us. So we figured out a scam that if you called the local industrial supply place and you said, we're part of a road crew doing a survey on air pollution. We're traveling across the country, and we need a tank of nitrous oxide to be the baseline for our gas chromatograph. We're currently parked in such and such a parking lot. Can we arrange to have a delivery made? And then somebody would put on straight clothes and they would show up with a truck and a tank of nitrous, and you'd give them $50 or whatever. Give them your old tank because there's a tank trade, and you'd roll the tank up on a bus and you'd roll away. Later, I started something, because that was too straight. I started something more outrageous. I had cards made that said that I had a company called Whipped Cream Fantasies. And the story then was that we did, don't make me laugh. we did whipped cream sculptures at concerts. And that,
so you really like this stuff, huh? You're quite imaginative.
So yeah, oh yeah. I mean, then I used to score. I used to score from the ambulance place 4 blocks from here 40 years ago. And I knew all the ambulance drivers because I'd come in on a Friday night Say, I need another tank of nitrous. We're doing another concert. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that all I did was party, because I didn't. I was always doing 2, 3, 4 things at once. And so the other thing I was trying to do at that point was work in the movie business, and I was successfully working, because I was always a guy who could get up in the morning and work for 4 or 5 days, and then get totally fucked up on the weekend, and and then pull it back together, and show up on Monday morning. So I was working on this, I was working on that. Stan Goldstein, the guy who had come to the hog farm and said, "Do you guys want to come to Woodstock?" And I had become close friends, and Stan lived in New York. Stan calls me up and he says, "Hey Andy, there's a jazz festival in the south of France." He said, "And we've chartered an airplane to take all the acts over. There's 1 seat available. You want to get on the plane?" And he said, "And there's a hotel. We took a wing of a hotel, so there'll be a room for you when you get there." I had $20. I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. But somebody invites you to go to France for a jazz festival, you say yes. So I got on the plane, and I went to the festival, and it was a mess, because they always are, and things were in disarray, and this is in the days before the festival actually starts. So I went into the office and I said, "Make me a badge that says Extraordinary Measures," and I still have that badge. And I went out to see what I could help straighten out, and I wandered down by the stage, and while I'm standing there, I see this arm swing out from nowhere, and it's got a camera on the end of it. Nobody has ever seen an arm with a camera at the end of it. There are cranes, but cranes are huge things, and 2 or 3 guys ride on them, and giant cameras, and they're ponderous. This is just a little skinny arm this big, but it's 25 feet long, and at the end is a camera, and it goes up over the stage, and the camera tilts straight down, and by this time I'm just stunned in amazement. And then the camera starts to rotate over the drum riser, and now I know I am seeing something that nobody has ever been able to do before in the history of film. This is an absolutely amazing device. So I go to find the people who are behind it. And it turns out it's 2 French guys, and one of them speaks a little bit of English, and the other one speaks no English at all. I have hair down to here, probably a beard like this one, but big and bushy and red, and I probably haven't slept in 2 or 3 days, and I'm probably on speed, and my arm is in a sling, and my jaw is wired shut. And I come up to it, I'm going to bring this to America. I don't know why they didn't believe me immediately, but we talked a little more, but nothing conclusive happened. On the way back, it turned out I knew one of the promoters of the festival, and on the way back, he told me they already had this thing locked up, and there were negotiations to bring it to America. But I told my friend Bobby about it, and then I kind of forgot about it, and I made up my mind I was going back to Hollywood, and I was going to go back to my career as a cameraman, and I was never going to leave the straight and narrow again. By this time I whatever I am, 27, 8, 29, 30. I'm old enough, so I'm beginning to see I'm having a lot of fun, but maybe I need a life too. So I go back to LA, and I move into a little apartment, and I start making phone calls every day. I make myself a promise. I got credit cards, I got no money. I make myself a promise I'm going to make 10 phone calls a day looking for work. And as long as I make those calls religiously and follow up on every one of them, I can live on the credit cards, because I figure either by the time the money runs out and they take the cards and cut them up, either I'm going to be working and I can pay the bill, or fuck them, it doesn't matter. So I'm doing that, and I get a job. At that point, actually, I get a job on a George Clinton P-Funk concert where the audience riots and charges the stage, and we're throwing cameras, because we're in a little terrace just below the stage, throwing cameras up, and the guards are pulling us up, and that's over. I skipped some stuff. And, you know, we can go back to it if it's necessary, but I had shot a couple of porno films a little earlier. And in one of them, I had introduced the director to cocaine. And it turned out that Michael really loved cocaine, and so he started to use way too much of it. And then Michael got kind of crazy, and then Michael came down to the set, and he didn't like what I was lighting. And I mean, we're talking about porn, but Michael didn't like what I was lighting. I said, Michael, not a problem, let me fix it for you. And it was a big deal. We were shooting in a motel room, and I had taken out a window and blacked it and whatever. So I relit it a second time, and he came back and he still hated it. And the third time he came back and he said that, I got furious and I started to chase him around the parking lot. So, you know, they had to bring somebody else in to finish that picture. I had not talked to Michael since then. But now I really needed a job. I went to same producer as the porno, but now this is a legit film. I went to Jeffrey and I said, hey Jeffrey, I'm really looking for a job. And he said, well, you know what? He said, if Michael's going to direct this next picture, I'll talk with him. If he's cool, we can let you shoot second unit on it. So Michael was cool, and we are lifelong friends since that day. And so I got hired to shoot second unit on a thing called Return to Jackson County, shooting in Arizona. It's about a year now since the Luma thing has happened. I drive to Arizona. We're shooting at Sedona, in and around Sedona. And you know, this is a long time ago again. There's no cell phones, there's no this, there's no that. The very first day, I get on the crew bus because I'm going to be like a camera operator when there's no second unit. I'm going to be second unit when there is second unit. I get on the bus with the cinematographer, who's a very famous French DP, a man named Willie Courant. And Willie is one of the original New Wave cinematographers, and we don't really know each other at all. He has accepted that I will do this. So we're trying to get to know each other, and we're chatting as we drive through the desert in Arizona. And to make conversation, I say, hey, Willie, when you were working in Paris, did you ever see this kind of crazy remote control crane? I didn't remember the name of it or anything. So, yes, you were talking about the Luma. And I said, yeah, Luma, that's the thing, you know. You don't remember the name of the guys that invented that? Well, yes, this is Jean-Marie Lavalou, and this is Alain Masseron. Fuck me, that's interesting. Hey, Willie, you wouldn't happen to have a way to get in touch with those guys, would you? And riding on the bus in the desert in Arizona, he takes out his phone book. He says, well, yes, it is right here, and it gives me a phone number. And I think to myself, you know, I got to call Bobby. And I got to tell Bobby that this has happened and just see if somehow something's still alive. We do the day shooting, we come back to the hotel. I have a paper message. You guys are old enough to remember. A paper message slip says, call Bobby at this phone number. I go up to my room and I call Bobby. Hey, what's going on? He says, you remember that thing you told me about? He said, you know, I think we ought to see if there's some way we could go after it. That fucking day. Yeah. So I give Bobby my information, and Bobby gets a lawyer, and they call and they start making arrangements. He calls me back in a few days. He says, when does the picture wrap? I tell him, we make arrangements. I drive back to LA. I get on a plane. I fly to New York. April 1st, I'll never forget. April 1st, we are in Paris. And we go to a place where the French guys are, and we negotiate with them for this crane, which Bobby's never seen. This is the first moment he ever sees it, but he's instantly convinced when he sees it. And it's done a little bit since then. It's been on, Roman Polanski film, The Tenant, but nobody in America knows of this thing at all. There's only one, they won't give it to us, but they give us some video footage, 3/4-inch tape showing a shot that they've made that demonstrates what it can do. And we take that back to America, and I don't believe this. And Stan Goldstein knows a guy who can edit it. And so he takes us to an editor, and that guy puts music on it and cuts it and everything, and we put narration on it. And I take a copy of it, the only copy of it, and I come back to LA, and now I have to try and find, we have 90 days to try and find, customers for this thing. I know a director, very talented director of commercials, and I said, yeah, he's a guy who will get it. So I call him up and I say, hey man, got this thing, I gotta show it to you. He said, well, we're editing on Santa Monica Boulevard, come on over. I come over, and it turns out his cinematographer, who happens to be there because they're editing, is my friend Steve Poster, who is a Chicago guy, and a guy who really should be threaded through this story at many times. As a matter of fact, it's Stevie who had hired me to be on the P-Funk concert, the first job I got back after I came back to LA. I showed a video, and I'm sure Freddie Stenger, who's the guy, I'm sure Freddie's just going to say, oh my God. And when it's finished, he looks at me and says, Andy, I don't get this thing. I don't know what I would do with it. And Stevie says, well, I know who would know what to do with it. He said, I know exactly what to do with it. He said, I just finished shooting second unit on Close Encounters. He said, Steven Spielberg is going to fall in love with this thing. So give me that tape. I'm going to take it to Spielberg. So I hand him the only copy of the tape. I mean, there's one in New York, I'm sure, but I hand him the only one in LA. And he disappears with it. And then nothing happens for about 10 days, and we're really panicked. And then one day we get a call from France. They say, Steven Spielberg is coming to see the crane, and this is so crazy, and all the rest of that. And it turned out that's what happened. I mean, and that's kind of a long story that this doesn't bear on this. But the bottom line is Spielberg goes to France. He takes one look at the crane. He says, I'm about to start a movie called 1941. Bring this thing. And so it's supposed to come for whatever it is, 6 weeks or something. And I'm the only American who, I'm attached. I'm attached in part because they think I know something about it. I know nothing about it at this point. And because I'm the only guy who's ever spoken to the French guys, and they can't speak English. So there is, somehow or other, I'm the guy. I fly to France. I spend a week learning the crane. They come back. They bring the crane to America. Both French guys come and make it work. You have to understand a little bit about the movie business at this point. Cinematographers are hired not just because they made a brilliant shot or this brilliant shot. They're hired for making 500 shots that fit together. And that no matter what happens, when the light goes bad, when this happens, when that happens, that they put together a team so talented and knowledgeable that no matter what happens, they can produce a reliable result every day. Guys like that don't like to experiment while they're on the clock. That's a real good way to make sure you never get to work again. Mm. So suddenly, we are with this crane, with the biggest crew in Hollywood, a guy named Bill Fraker, wonderful, extremely talented guy, the best grips, the best gaffers, the best of everything. And Spielberg has said, Billy, you're using that crane. Billy's a little bit we'll see about that. And so for the first weeks, they test us and they test it and they hold back. And now, Stephen, we don't need to do that. Well, let's do that with this, and so on and so on. But they begin to understand, and Spielberg begins to understand. Spielberg begins to invent the remote crane shot. And I will tell you that in the course of one movie, he created virtually all of the language of the lightweight crane on the end of a long arm. He understood that you could move it so quickly back and forth horizontally that you could skewer through things. There were so many things that he got first. And then, because he had a big movie with a big cast, musical numbers and all the rest of that, he got to experiment and play with it and figure it out. The movie was not a success. But during the course of that time, other filmmakers who watched it said, yeah, he doesn't know how to do a comedy. But wow, did you see how that camera went from here to there? And so we started to work right away. And at first there was the two Frenchmen, and then very quickly the Americans said, the fuck is that second guy do? He speaks French. We don't need him. Get rid of him. So then it was me and the French guy who spoke English, and we became, I became lifelong companions and friends, and we did a few pictures together. Eventually he left, and then I started training other people, and we started to do days on every big movie, because once one guy proves a thing works like that, then all the other guys say, I gotta have the Luma. I got a sequence that's just perfect. No, you gotta get me that crane. No, I understand it's expensive, but I need it for my vision. And so in 2 years, we worked on one big picture after another. We worked for, for Hal Ashby, and we worked for just, this guy and that guy and that guy. And suddenly, so the other thing that happened for me was I started being a day player. The way Hollywood works is, or had worked until this time, was you made your way. You got in as a camera department as the lowest of assistants, a loader, and you went in the dark room and you changed the film, and then they trusted you to be a second assistant. You moved cases on the set, and after a few years, then they trusted you to be a first assistant. Now you pulled focus and told the other guys what to do, and so on. Then after 10 years, you became a camera operator. Now they trusted you to pan and tilt the camera, because this is before video assist, or at the beginning of video assist. And when the camera operator said, yeah, I got it, you trusted him, because maybe tomorrow you were no longer in the same building, so doing the same shot. I mean, the stakes were entirely different. The world was entirely different. So guys got on camera teams. They stayed with the same cinematographer, sometimes for 20 years.
Right.
But then there are other kinds of guys who are specialists, and those are day players, and I was a day player. So I met every cinematographer that was busy shooting in those days in a 4 or 5 year span. I'll tell you Connie Hall's story. Connie called me out to do one of the last things I ever did. Warren Beatty picture. Oh, fuck. I'm not going to be able to tell you the name, but I can look it up on IMDb. Had one shot to do. I don't remember what it was, and I'll tell you in part why I don't remember what it was, because they kept us waiting all day to do it. And why they kept us waiting all day was, this is how it was working at this point. Conrad would light a scene and get everything. And Conrad, one of the most artistic eyes ever in Hollywood, an enormous gentleman, a charismatic, warm and loving guy. And Connie would finish lighting a set that anybody else in the world would be happy with. And then Warren Beatty would come out of his trailer, and he would sit down in the chair where he was supposed to do the scene, and he'd say, roll the camera, but he didn't mean the film camera. He meant the video tap that by that time was standard on film cameras. And he'd do this a little bit, and then he'd say, all right, let's take a look. And he'd walk over and look at the monitor, and then he'd look at the monitor, and then he got up and he said, Connie, you're not protecting the meat. Connie, come on, help me out, okay? And he'd turn around and walk away. He'd go back in his trailer, and Connie lit it a second time. And I swear to you, Warren came back a second time, and he did the same thing again. And unlike me, he did not chase him around the set. Instead, being the gentleman that he was, he lit it a third time. And the third time, Warren looked at it and they said, all right, let's roll a little film on this one. And I thought, hey, we're going to do the shot, then we'll do my shot, we'll get out of here. No, what he meant was, we'll roll some film and send it to the lab, and then I'll look at that on Monday, and I'll decide whether this lighting is okay for my close-up. I think he didn't want to finish the picture because this was the last day, and for reasons of his own, he just wanted it to go on a little bit further. So this is a Friday night, and it's wrap night. And they say, all right, we're done. And there's supposed to be a little after party, not like a wrap party, but so there's a big table with spread and booze and all the rest of that, and everybody eats and drinks and go home. And that weekend, is a big earthquake. I think this must be whatever it is, 94 earthquake.
94, yeah.
Maybe the 94 earthquake, maybe an earlier one. Either way, the set falls down, and on Monday there's no place to come back and shoot. And so we had to wait for them to rebuild the set before we could come back and finish the movie. Somewhere in that process, I think I came back to do the shot, but maybe they just said, we don't need that shot. I'm going to try now and collapse, after telling you a lot about a moment here and a moment there, I'm going to try and collapse 20 minutes into a minute or so. I've worked on a lot of pictures. Eventually, the Luma moved from Bobby's company, Film Trucks, to Panavision. Eventually, in a complicated series of moves, I ended up going to work for Panavision, and it changed my life. I became an executive. I ran a division of Panavision called Panavision Electronic Systems or something like that made video cameras for a little while. And I left and I started a company called First Light Video Publishing that produced and distributed instructional videotapes. And then the Luma came back in my life, and we rented it very successfully as Luma LA, and we started to rent other cranes. And then we sold that business to Panavision, and I went back to Panavision now as the president of a company called Panavision Remote Systems. And obviously by this time I'm not taking drugs anymore, maybe not so obviously I've gotten married and my life is very different, and I actually get up in the morning, go to work, and I come home at night, and I have survived somehow a lot of that first crazy 40 years. After, 20 years or something at Panavision, by this point I had become a corporate executive. I was EVP Technical Marketing and Strategy for Panavision Worldwide. I was there for the second major chance to influence the path of technology and filmmaking in Hollywood, something I will forever be grateful for. I was there for the introduction of digital cameras and was one of the guys who went out to those first filmmakers the same way we had gone out to Spielberg the first time and said, let's talk about this. Let's see if this makes sense for you, for anything you're doing. Tell us what you're doing. And we would listen, and we would figure out the thing that it made sense for. And we'd say, why don't you give this a try? And so we introduced digital cinematography. And that was an amazing ride. That was 4 or 5 years, but then that was over and it got kind of boring. And then another 2-3 CEOs came through, and I lasted happily with all of them. And then finally another CEO came in and said, who is this guy? What the fuck does he do? And I have to say, in retrospect, he was probably right. What the fuck did I do? Because they didn't need a guy who did what I did, and I got a lot of money. So one day they said, Andy, go away. And at first I was furious, but I had a little money to walk away on. And in that year afterwards, when I was not allowed to work, my wife and I used to go out in the backyard every morning and say, the guy who had fired me was a guy named John Sue. They would say, God bless you, John Sue, because I had a chance to turn back to where I had started, which was shooting stills. I didn't want to work in movies anymore. I could have. But I really wanted to make images again. And so I picked up a still camera, digital camera now, and I started to reteach myself, and I needed a big project. And so I got kind of interested in the Pacific Design Center, a very large 3-building complex on the west side of LA. And I talked myself into it. I said I wanted to spend 6 months there shooting every day, and I would shoot the people, and I would shoot the comings and goings, and I would shoot the architecture, and I would try to capture this very complex, multi-100,000-foot structure, and bring it to life for people who had never seen it. And that's what I did for 6 months. I went there every day, and I discovered, I've never been good at sticking with things that didn't interest me. I get in, I learn how they work, I try to make a success out of them, and then I say, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I want to do something else. I couldn't do that this time because I had said I'm going to spend this 6 months here, and 3 months in, you pretty much shot the hell out of a building, but I couldn't leave, and I had to rethink that, and so I made myself a promise that I didn't have to shoot anything. I didn't have to make another picture. But I had to show up every day and sit there and look at it. So every day I took my camera, I went, and I'd sit there. And what started to happen, of course, was that I would sit there and the light would change. And after a half an hour, I'd say, oh God, look at that over there. Oh, there's a picture over there. And I'd make a new picture. And every day I did that. And I began to see life in that place where I'd never seen it before. So I made I made a real study of that place, and it ended up with a big show, 100 and some odd prints, and people really loved the work and everything, and that's great, and I loved that. But what was really important to me was that I had learned a very important thing about making pictures. I had always been in a rush to make them. I'd always been, from the day of Herschel Lewis, actually, that had been, come on, we got to get it, got to get it, come on, Andy, or shooting bar mitzvahs. You cannot say, okay, let's take a moment, turn you a little bit. No, come on, get that picture, get onto the next table. And I began to understand that the first thing that I had to do was to not take a picture. The first thing I had to do was to look. And that the only way you could look was to slow down and to pay attention. Just let it be there. And that was an important thing to know. So it finished. Now I was done with the Pacific Design Center, and I needed something new to do, and I cast around for a while, and I found myself kind of attracted to iconography. Buddhas, but Christ figures, Marys, whatever. I was really kind of interested in them. I didn't quite know what to make of that. So one day I'm out with my wife, go for a walk. 2-3 blocks from here, there's a Buddhist temple, and I've always known that Buddhist temple was there, but paid no attention to it. And we're walking by it, and I said, I'd like to walk in there. I'm curious about it. She said, no, come on, we're walking. No. I said, no, please, I just want to go for a minute. So we walk around back because there is no front entrance. It's on a major business street, but the entrance is actually hidden in the back. And there's nobody there, and I knock on the door, nobody answers, but I push the door and it opens, so I walk in, and I call out, hello, and after a moment, a monk comes, and it turns out he's a Korean Buddhist monk, and he doesn't speak any English, but he welcomes us in. He says, motions, take off your shoes, and come and look. And I come in, and I go into the next room. There's this gold and beautiful Buddha, just glowing there. And I don't have a camera with me or anything like that, but I make it clear to him. He speaks a few words of English, of course. I make it clear to him that I'd like to come back and photograph the place. Oh yes, you'll come back, camera, yes, okay. As I'm leaving, he reaches under the counter and he gives me 2 books. And one of them is a history of Buddhism, and the other one is a book about the art and culture of Korea from the, year 1000 to 1700 or whatever, and then there's a later volume I later discovered. Some nights later, I'm reading that book in bed, middle of the night, 3 o'clock, you can't sleep, And I read about a painting made in the 13th century in Korea, and it's called 15,000 Buddhas. And it is a painting 6 or 8 feet across that appears to be a single Buddha, and over it the words 15,000 Buddhas in Korean, but it's in fact 15,000 tiny little drawings of the Buddha that some monk spent years and years and years of his life painting. And that connects with me. And I know immediately now what my project is, and that my project is going to be called 15,000 Buddhas, because what I want to do is the same thing. I want to make 15,000 images, not to make a single image, but to make a kaleidoscope, to make a panoply of religious experience, of the way people experience religious iconography. And so then I spent 3 or 4 years doing that. And I shot in Eastern Europe, and I shot in Western Europe, and I shot across the United States. I shot museums. I never got to Asia, but I shot a lot of Asian art in various art museums and stuff. And all of those images are made not as a straightforward representation, here's a Chevrolet, but rather to try to understand how the artist who made the image looked at it and the way they saw it and how it is intended to be seen. And so one of the things I found myself doing very much was I would go into these places and I would sit. Again, just put the camera down and sit until I felt it was time to rise and stand near a statue. And then I would really slowly move around it. And while I moved, I would talk to it. I would say, where do you want me to show you? Where's the place? Please tell me. And sooner or later, always there would be a moment and I would light up. I could feel it up inside of me, I'd just be like, that's the place. And then I would pick up the camera and say, thank you. And I would start shooting. And then once you're open like that, everything in the place opens up for you. And you just, then it's, you're there. Yeah, I'll be right with you. and so on and so on. So that was Buddhist. And I did that I still do that one. If I find something new and interesting, eventually, one of the reasons I did that one was I said, I wanted a project so large I couldn't know the end of it. And I wanted a project about which I knew nothing and that I would make no attempt to discover it intellectually, but rather would only have the experience of it. And so that was, for the first couple of years, that was pretty much the way it went. But eventually what happens is, in the course of doing this, you meet the people who take care of those icons, right? You meet the priests and the rabbis and the and the preachers and the ministers and the museum people, and you ask them questions and they tell you stuff, and now you begin to know what the symbolism is behind them, and that's very interesting, but in a way it also is distancing from just knowledge of the thing itself. And so I've kind of done, let's say, a lot of Marys. I got a pretty good idea about how Mary is represented certainly in Western Europe and in America. But I know, for instance, that if I ever went to Africa, there is a different Mary there, and I know I would get excited again to see those and to photograph those. In the meantime, I being here, I had kind of come to the end of that as a full-time thing. But that work, for the moment seemed to be kind of done. And I was casting about for the next thing I wanted to do. By this time I know I want big projects. I'm not interested in making 10 pictures. I'm interested in making 1,000 pictures. I'm interested in finding a way to show you more than one aspect of a thing, but many aspects of a thing. And I had a huge love as a kid for motorcycles. I didn't talk about that a lot earlier, but from the time I was sort of 13 or 14 until I was 40, I rode all the time. I had many, many, many bikes. I built bikes, I raced bikes. At the end I had 3 bikes, even then I had a dirt bike and I had a canyon bike and I had a road bike, but I was done. And so I put that away at 40. But at 75, I got interested again. I got interested in cars again and motorcycles. And I started to think about them, and I started to go out to places to venues where they would be there, motorcycle shows, because choppers had evolved. I used to build choppers, and choppers had evolved and become these amazing. It had always been art, but now the art was so startling. It's so fine. And so I began to photograph motorcycles, and I had to find my own way to do that. So I began to shoot them in sunlit conditions when that was possible. But whether I shot them in sunlight or whether I shot them indoors, I wanted to abstract them, so I removed them from their backgrounds. I make them generally with black backgrounds. I started shooting cars again. I went to Bonneville. In 1973, I had gone to Bonneville and photographed a very famous race car in the year that it went 266 miles an hour, an open roadster. And that record held for 30 years. I went back to Bonneville after from 1973 all the way to this year. I went back and I shot a bunch of cars and motorcycles there. And so this is the project I'm working on now. is to see motorcycles in particular, but cars as well, as I saw them as a kid. To help, to try to make you feel how much they excited me, how much the pure mechanical truth of them excited me. Here's this shot, you're looking straight ahead, and here's this, and then there's all of that, but no. You turn a motorcycle a little bit, and now the pipes reveal the line along the frame. You turn the wheel a little bit, and this happens, and you get down to where you're just dead level with the engine, and now the motor is, to me, the heart of a motorcycle is the motor. Modern bikes with the big fairings and stuff don't particularly interest me, honestly, as much, because I deeply love the mechanical truth of a motorcycle, the simplicity, the idea of this thing, two wheels, and this motor, the sound of that exhaust, the smell of that thing, and the way that it moves in the world. I want to make pictures of those bikes that show you some sense of how I feel that motorcycle move through the world, even though it's standing still.
Tell me your story. Tell me where you come from, you. Ya ta ta.